Imagine you are standing in a city at midnight. Not just any city, ancient Babylon, 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. The streets are silent. The priests are awake. In a chamber lit by oil lamps, a man carves words into a clay tablet. Words he believes will reach across the invisible wall between the living and the dead. Words designed not to heal, not to protect, but to destroy. This tablet still exists. It sits today in the British Museum in London, catalog number K2987, one of thousands of cuneiform texts excavated from ancient Mesopotamia. Scholars have translated it. It is a curse ritual, specific, methodical, and chillingly detailed. Black magic is one of the oldest human impulses on record, and yet we know almost nothing true about it, because history has buried it under centuries of fear, superstition, political persecution, and Hollywood mythology. Today, we are going to dig it up. This is not a ghost story. This is not entertainment designed to make you afraid of the dark. This is the real history of black magic, sourced from archaeological records, court documents, academic research, and primary historical texts. What you are about to hear is documented. It is verifiable. And in many ways, it is more disturbing than any fiction. Because the truth is this: across every civilization, in every century, in every corner of the world, human beings have believed in the power of unseen forces. They have tried to harness those forces. And the line between religion, medicine, and what we call black magic has never been as clear as we pretend. So let us begin. At the beginning. Chapter 1. Babylon and the Birth of Cursing. The word magic itself comes from the ancient Persian magus, the priestly class of Zoroastrian religion. These were scholars of astronomy, ritual, and what we would today call proto-science. They were not criminals. They were the intellectuals of their age. But the tradition of manipulating invisible forces for harm is older than Persia. In ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, archaeologists have uncovered an entire genre of texts called maklu, meaning burning. These are ritual manuals, anti-witchcraft manuals to be precise. Here is what is fascinating about the maklu texts. They tell us that Babylonian society was terrified of witches. Not hypothetically terrified, legally, practically terrified. Babylonian law, specifically the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BC, contained explicit provisions for accusations of witchcraft. If a man accused another of practicing magic and could not prove it, the accuser himself could be put to death. Think about that. In one of the world's first written legal codes, magic was taken seriously enough to carry the death penalty. The maklu ritual texts describe witches, called kashaptu in Sumerian, as beings who could bind a man's limbs, steal his prosperity, make him impotent, cause his crops to fail. The cure? An elaborate counter-ritual involving burning wax figurines of the witch while reciting incantations to the god Marduk. This is perhaps the earliest recorded use of what we now call sympathetic magic, the idea that manipulating a representation of a person affects the real person. It would echo across every culture that followed. Chapter 2. Egypt. Magic as State Power. Move west across the desert and we enter ancient Egypt, a civilization where magic was not underground. It was official government policy. The Egyptians had a word for magical practice, Heka, and Heka was considered a fundamental force of the universe, as real and measurable as gravity. Every Egyptian priest was expected to understand it. the pharaoh himself was considered its supreme master. But within Heka, there was a dark tradition.
The execration texts, discovered in large quantities at archaeological sites near Luxor and Cairo, are some of the most unsettling artifacts in human history. These are objects, usually clay figures or pottery shards, inscribed with the names of enemies, foreign rulers, rebellious Egyptians, even the abstract forces of chaos. The objects were then ritually smashed, broken, or buried, the idea being that this symbolic destruction would cause real destruction in the physical world. What makes this extraordinary is the scale. These were not individual acts of private revenge. The Egyptian state commissioned execration rituals. Foreign kings were named by name. Their cities were named. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of a weapons program, except the weapons were words and broken pottery. Harvard Egyptologist Robert Rittner, in his landmark 1993 study, The Mechanics of Ancient Egyptian Magical Practice, documented this in exhaustive detail. The execration tradition lasted over 1,000 years. Magic in ancient Egypt was not superstition for the uneducated. It was a technology of power, wielded by the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Chapter 3: Greece, Rome, and the Curse Tablets. Now, move to the Mediterranean world of ancient Greece and Rome. And here, the evidence becomes almost overwhelming in its volume. Archaeologists have recovered over 1,500 objects called deficciones, or curse tablets. These are thin sheets of lead, inscribed with curses, folded up, sometimes pierced with a nail, and deposited in graves, wells, springs, or temples. They have been found across the entire Roman world, from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Turkey. And they are disturbingly ordinary. These were not written by priests or sorcerers. They were written by everyday people. A merchant cursing a business rival, a charioteer cursing a competing team, a woman cursing the man who left her, a litigant cursing his opponent before a trial.
One tablet found in Bath, England, at the Roman shrine of the goddess Sulis Minerva, reads, "Whether pagan or Christian, whether man or woman, whether boy or girl, whether slave or free, whoever has stolen from me, Onianus, 6 silver coins, I give to the goddess Minerva, that she may exact them from him through his blood." That tablet is real. You can see it today at the Roman Baths Museum in Bath. It dates to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. What strikes scholars is not just that people curse their enemies. Human beings have always done that. What strikes them is the infrastructure that existed to support it. There were professional curse writers. There were temples where you could deposit a curse for a fee. Curse tablets have been found in the workshops of metalworkers, suggesting that specialists manufactured them on demand. Cursing was, in the ancient world, a service industry. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History in 77 AD, documented dozens of magical practices with evident disgust, but also with the careful attention of a man who finds them genuinely threatening. He describes the power of the evil eye, the use of blood and entrails in ritual, and the practice of binding magic. The Roman state was deeply ambivalent about magic. On one hand, official religion was itself full of ritual. On the other hand, magic used against the state or against private individuals was a serious crime. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest law code from around 450 BC, prohibited crop magic, defined as ritually transferring a neighbor's harvest to one's own fields. By the imperial period, practicing certain forms of magic, particularly anything involving death or the emperor, was punishable by exile or execution. The historian Tacitus records multiple trials for magical conspiracy against emperors Augustus, Tiberius, and others. Magic was dangerous not because no one believed in it. It was dangerous because everyone did.
Chapter 4: The Church, the Devil, and the Making of Black Magic. Here is where the story takes a sharp turn. Because the concept of black magic as a distinct, morally condemned category of practice does not truly exist in the ancient world. In Babylon, in Egypt, in Greece, and Rome, magic was morally neutral. It was a tool. It could be used for protection or for harm. What mattered was who used it and against whom. The Christian Church changed that. The early church had a problem. The people it was converting across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa already had deeply rooted magical traditions. Folk healers who used herbs and charms. People who prayed to local spirits and left offerings at sacred springs. Diviners who read omens. All of this was embedded in daily life. The church's solution was categorical. There was God, there was the devil. There was no middle ground. Any magic not explicitly authorized by the church, prayer, sacraments, official exorcism, must therefore come from the devil. This was not a gradual shift. It was a theological decision with enormous consequences. The key document in this transformation is the Canon Episcopi, a church regulation circulating by the 10th century that described women who claimed to fly through the night with a pagan goddess as deluded, as victims of demonic illusion. Interestingly, the early church did not believe that witches had real power. They believed that those who thought they had power were being deceived by Satan. This would change dramatically in the 15th century.
Chapter 5: The Witch Trials. Fear as Policy. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published a book called The Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for The Hammer of Witches. It is one of the most consequential books ever written, and one of the most dangerous. The Malleus argued in exhaustive and systematic detail that witchcraft was real, that witches made physical pacts with the devil, that they could genuinely harm people through magic, and that the church had both the right and the duty to identify and execute them.
It also argued explicitly and at length that women were far more susceptible to diabolical temptation than men. The reasoning was theological and deeply misogynistic. Women were weaker of faith, more carnal, more easily seduced. This framing would shape witch hunting for the next 2 centuries. The book was a bestseller. The printing press had been invented just a few decades earlier, and the Malleus went through at least 14 editions before 1520. Judges across Europe used it as a handbook. What followed was a period that historians now call the Great Witch Hunt, though the popular image of it is largely incorrect. The witch trials were not a single event. They unfolded across Europe and colonial America in waves, from roughly 1430 to 1750. The best current scholarly estimates, compiled by historians Brian Levack and Wolfgang Behringer, suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft during this period. Roughly 3/4 of them were women. These were not medieval peasants executing isolated old women. Many of the most intense persecution periods occurred in the 17th century, the age of Shakespeare, Galileo, and Descartes. Educated men, including lawyers, judges, and physicians, participated enthusiastically. The Salem witch trials of 1692, perhaps the best-known outbreak in the Anglophone world, resulted in the execution of 19 people
and the imprisonment of over 100 more. The accused ranged in age from 5 to 71. What caused these outbreaks? Historians have proposed many explanations. Religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, economic stress, social tensions, climate disruption from what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age. Probably all of these played a role. But one factor stands above the others: the infrastructure of accusation. Once a legal system decided that witchcraft was real and prosecutable, once torture was permitted to extract confessions, and once those confessions routinely implicated neighbors and family members, a social mechanism of cascading accusation became almost inevitable. Black magic in the early modern period was not primarily a spiritual phenomenon. It was a political weapon. Chapter 6: Africa, the Americas, and the world beyond Europe. European witch hunting is the version of this story that most people know. But the belief in harmful magic and the social and legal responses to it is not a European story. It is a human story. In West Africa, the concept of harmful magic is embedded in some of the most sophisticated religious traditions on Earth. The Yoruba tradition, which spread through the Atlantic slave trade to become the foundation of candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, and voodoo in Haiti, contains within it a category of practitioners believed capable of causing harm, the Age, or night witches.
But here is what is critical to understand. Within these traditions, the boundary between healing and harm, between protection and attack, is fluid. The same knowledge that allows a healer to cure disease can, in theory, be reversed to cause it. The moral status of a practitioner depends not on the knowledge they hold, but on how they use it. This is fundamentally different from the Christian framework that produced the witch trials. There is no devil in Yoruba cosmology. There is power, and there is choice. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, among the Aztec and Maya civilizations, practitioners called Nawali, or Nawal, were believed capable of transforming into animals and causing harm. Spanish colonial records, imperfect and biased as they are, document the systematic persecution of these practitioners after the conquest, as the church attempted to suppress indigenous religious practice by categorizing it as diabolism. In India, the tradition of Tantra, often misunderstood in the West as primarily sexual, contains within it a category of practices called Vama Marga, or the left-hand path, which involve rituals using prohibited substances, and in some texts, rituals intended to harm enemies. Academic scholars like David Gordon White and Ronald Davidson have studied these traditions in depth, finding them rooted in highly sophisticated philosophical systems, however disturbing some of their applications may appear. In China, the practice of goo poisoning, a legendary form of harmful magic involving the cultivation of venomous insects, was taken seriously enough by Tang Dynasty law around the 7th century AD to be treated as a capital crime equivalent to treason. The pattern is consistent across cultures and centuries. Every human society has believed in the possibility of harmful magic. Every human society has developed legal or social mechanisms to identify and punish those believed to practice it. And in almost every case, those mechanisms have been used disproportionately against the marginalized: women, the poor, ethnic minorities, those who live on the social periphery. Chapter 7: Aleister Crowley and the Occult Revival. By the 19th century, educated Europeans had largely stopped believing in literal witchcraft as a criminal offense. The last official execution for witchcraft in England had occurred in 1682, the last in Scotland in 1727. Witch trials in the legal sense were over. But something interesting happened in their absence. The occult, the word simply means hidden, became fashionable. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in secret magical traditions,
Freemasonry had already been growing for a century. Now came Rosicrucianism, theosophy, founded by the extraordinary and deeply strange Helena Blavatsky in 1875, and a proliferation of magical orders and secret societies. The most famous, or infamous, figure to emerge from this world was Aleister Crowley. Born in 1875 in England into a wealthy family of Plymouth Brethren Christians, Crowley rejected his upbringing completely and spent his adult life constructing an elaborate magical system he called Thelema. His central principle, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," was deliberately provocative.
Crowley called himself the Great Beast and the wickedest man in the world. He cultivated scandal the way other men cultivate gardens. He was widely reported to practice blood sacrifice and sexual magic. The British press adored and loathed him in equal measure. Here is the complication that serious historians of religion, like Marco Passi of the University of Amsterdam, who has written extensively on Crowley, are careful to note. Crowley was, by any serious analysis, a highly educated scholar of comparative religion, a genuine poet, and a complex figure whose reputation for evil was at least partially a performance.
Was he practicing harmful magic? By his own definition, yes. He believed his rituals had real effects on the world. Did those rituals actually harm anyone in a documentable way? That is a different question, and the historical record does not provide a clear answer. What Crowley did do was pull the occult tradition into the 20th century, where it would influence everyone from the founders of Scientology — L. Ron Hubbard was personally acquainted with Crowley's work — to modern neo-pagan movements.
Chapter 8. Black Magic Today, the Living Tradition. Here is where the history becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because black magic, however defined, is not history. It is present tense. In 2017, the BBC reported extensively on a wave of child abuse cases in the United Kingdom linked to beliefs in Kindoki, a Congolese concept of child witchcraft in which children are believed to be possessed by evil spirits. Abuse was carried out by family members and religious authorities attempting to perform exorcisms. British police documented hundreds of such cases in London alone.
In sub-Saharan Africa, the persecution of people accused of witchcraft, including children, is documented by human rights organizations, including the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch.
In some regions of Tanzania, people accused of witchcraft, often elderly women with unusual physical characteristics such as red eyes, are killed. The numbers are difficult to verify precisely, but estimated deaths run into the hundreds per year. In India, the practice of Dain Pratha, witch hunting, was documented by the National Crime Records Bureau as recently as 2020. Hundreds of people, predominantly women, are killed every year in India after being accused of practicing harmful magic. Meanwhile, in the Western world, interest in what practitioners call chaos magic, a postmodern magical tradition that explicitly brackets questions of metaphysical reality and focuses on magic as a psychological technology, has grown steadily. It has a significant online presence and has influenced everything from marketing psychology to contemporary art. And in the United States, the legal status of Wicca, a neo-pagan religion that emerged in England in the 1950s and spread globally, as a protected religion, was affirmed in multiple federal court decisions in the 1980s and 1990s. The living landscape of magic, including its harmful forms, is not monolithic. It spans everything from the genuinely dangerous social persecution of innocent people to sophisticated philosophical traditions, to pop culture aesthetics. What it is not, at any point in its history, is simple. So, what black magic tells us about ourselves? We began tonight in ancient Babylon, a man carving words into clay in the dark. We have traveled through Egyptian temples,
Roman courtrooms, medieval inquisitions, West African forests, Aztec cities, and the tabloid press of Edwardian England. What does it all mean? Here is what the historical record actually shows us. First, the belief in harmful magic is universal. It appears in every culture for which we have documentation, across every period of recorded history. This is not a primitive belief that civilization has outgrown. It is a persistent feature of human consciousness.
Second, the fear of harmful magic has been used repeatedly and deliberately as a tool of social control, to silence women, to eliminate rivals, to persecute minorities, to consolidate power. The witch trial is not primarily a story about magic. It is a story about what human beings do to each other when fear is weaponized and given legal authority. Third, the line between magic and religion, between what any given society considers legitimate spiritual practice and what it condemns as diabolism, has always been drawn by the powerful. The Egyptian priest performing an execration ritual was a statesman. The accused witch in Salem performing a charm was a criminal. The difference between them was not what they did, it was who held power.
And fourth, perhaps most importantly, the fascination with black magic, the appeal of the forbidden, the desire to believe that words and symbols and rituals can reshape the physical world, this has never gone away. It is present in the person who lit a candle and made a wish. It is present in every culture's mythology, every religion's concept of prayer, every tradition's understanding that invisible forces can shape visible outcomes.